The arrival of the monstrous. The year was 2269. Earth had become a hub of intergalactic exploration, with humanity's technology now at the forefront of the galaxy. Earth's colonies stretched across the stars, and humanity had established diplomatic relations with several alien races. However, nothing could have prepared humanity for the arrival of the Zathor. The Zathor were a race of fierce, towering aliens, their bodies covered in thick black exoskeletal armor that shimmered with iridescent veins. They stood over 12 feet tall, their glowing eyes piercing through the dark skies of any world they touched. The very sight of their ships was enough to send shivers down any soldier's spine. Massive, blocky warships, with engines that hummed with a strange, ominous power. When the Zathor warships entered Earth's atmosphere, they unleashed hell. Unlike the usual conquerors, the Zathor didn't waste time negotiating or even observing. They immediately attacked, ripping apart Earth's defenses with overwhelming firepower. The cities of New York, London, and Moscow fell within hours. Lieutenant Commander Derek Hall, an experienced officer in Earth's Special Forces, was stationed at a military base in the Midwest. He had faced battles before, but nothing like this. As sirens wailed, he knew something was terribly wrong. The Zathor were not here for diplomacy. They were here to annihilate. But Derek's team had been preparing for a covert mission in the heart of the enemy's war zone, and they were now thrust into the chaos of humanity's final defense. "We have reports of Zathor, ground forces 20 miles out." Sergeant Blake's voice echoed through Derek's earpiece. "They're not just fighters, sir. These ones are different." Before Derek could respond, a loud crash reverberated through the air. A Zathor warship had just entered Earth's atmosphere, its nose burning through the sky as if it was a comet, and it crashed into the Earth with tremendous force. "Brace for impact!" Derek shouted, diving for cover. The explosion from the crash sent shockwaves that knocked Derek and his squad out cold, and everything went black. Chapter 2. Awakening. Derek awoke to a world turned upside down. His head throbbed with pain, and his body felt like it had been through a grinder. His ears rang, but the most immediate sensation was the burning heat in the air. Smoke swirled around him, and pieces of rubble were scattered everywhere. His squad had been scattered or destroyed by the blast. He struggled to sit up, trying to find the strength to stand. "Sergeant Blake?" Derek called, his voice hoarse, but there was no response. He stumbled to his feet, surveying the wreckage. The Zathor warship had created a massive crater, and in the center of it was something far worse. A massive creature, a true nightmare. It was unlike the Zathor warriors he had seen before. This was something more, something monstrous. The creature was serpentine, with black scaled skin and dozens of writhing, muscular tentacles extending from its body. Each tentacle had sharp metallic spikes that glinted in the dim light. Its face was covered in dark tendrils, glowing like fireflies, and its large dark eyes pierced the air with an eerie, predatory calm. The moment Derek saw the creature, he felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. It was as if the creature was aware of him, and its mere presence was a call to arms for the Zathor forces. A chilling screech echoed across the battlefield, and Derek's heart raced as the alien beasts began to mobilize. The sky overhead split open as more Zathor ships descended, their hulking shapes blocking out the sun. This was no ordinary battle. This was an invasion, and Derek knew the war had just taken a horrifying turn. This new threat, this monstrous entity, was no mere leader. It was the focal point of the Zathor's entire strategy. As the creature's eyes locked onto Derek, it let out a spine-chilling roar. A terrible, guttural voice filled his mind. "You are weak. You will serve or perish." Derek felt the weight of the creature's words as if they were sinking into his very soul. Fear gripped him, but there was something else, too. The sensation of being trapped between an enemy he didn't understand and a fate he couldn't escape. Before he could make a decision, the creature turned its attention to the distant horizon, where more Zathor forces were emerging from their ships. Derek's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen. Chapter 3. The Queen's Call. As Derek stood motionless, a new wave of terror filled the air. The monstrous creature's tendrils quivered, and its dark eyes pulsed with an unnatural glow. It wasn't just calling to the Zathor troops. It was calling to something else, something far more terrifying. A sudden rush of wind surged as a colossal figure emerged from the wreckage of the Zathor warship. This was the true leader, the creature's progenitor, a towering skeletal being, its body bristling with sharp, jagged spines. Its face was covered in a tangled mess of dark, shadowy tendrils. The creature, far taller than any of the Zathor warriors, let out an earth-shattering scream that split the sky. "You are the chosen one." Derek's mind exploded with an intrusive voice, like the creature was invading his very thoughts. He staggered backward, clutching his head. He wasn't prepared for this. No one was. His world had just shattered. The massive being reached out with one of its long, gnarled limbs. Derek's heart pounded as the tendrils from the creature's arm coiled around him like a noose, lifting him from the ground. His body was suspended in midair, and he was forced to face the creature's terrifying visage. "Let me go!" Derek shouted, but the creature's grip tightened. The being's dark eyes glimmered with an ancient power. "You will bond with me," it spoke in his mind. "Your fate is now mine." At that moment, Derek realized something even more disturbing. The creature was not merely intending to kill him, it was claiming him, and not just his body, his very essence. The creature's tendrils burrowed into his skin, sending waves of energy through his body. It was a bond, a union that felt like it was tearing him apart. He could feel its power coursing through him, changing him, making him something different. "You will be my vessel," the creature whispered. Derek's vision began to blur, the lines between his mind and the creature's beginning to blur. He could feel the alien's consciousness intertwining with his. His body, now under its control, jerked and twisted as if controlled by an outside force. Chapter 4. Unlikely Alliances. As Derek struggled to maintain control of his body, his thoughts became muddled, and his will was weakened by the overwhelming presence of the creature inside him. The creature, which Derek now realized was a Zathor queen, had taken control of his mind, and its power felt like a vice slowly squeezing the life out of him. But deep within the maelstrom of thoughts, Derek heard a familiar voice. "Derek!" The voice was sharp and urgent. It was Ava Torres, a fellow soldier and one of the few remaining members of his squad. Ava had been searching for him ever since the blast, and her voice had finally reached him. She wasn't far, and her strength was the one thing that could help him fight the Queen's hold on him. But time was running out. If the Queen completed the bond, Derek would be lost forever. With every ounce of his remaining willpower, Derek fought back against the creature's influence. "Ava," he whispered, hoping the connection between them could still reach her. "Help me. I'm losing control." Through the fog of his mind, Derek could feel Ava's presence near him. She had always been a strong and reliable ally, and now she was his only hope. Ava's voice cut through the darkness. "Don't fight it, Derek. I know you're still in there. Listen to me. We're going to get you out of this." Chapter 5. The Heart of the Storm. Derek could feel the Queen's presence pressing against his consciousness, squeezing out his thoughts like the grip of a vice. Her power was overwhelming, ancient, and dark, filling his mind with the promises of control and unimaginable strength. The alien Queen's thoughts echoed relentlessly, pulling him toward submission. But then Ava's voice broke through, sharp and clear, cutting through the darkness of Derek's mind like a beacon. "Stay with me, Derek. You're not lost, not yet. We can still fight this. Ava's voice rang out, stronger than the alien force trying to control him. Her words felt like a lifeline in the storm. Ava had arrived, just as Derek had hoped. She was the only person who could bring him back from the edge, back to the person he used to be. Even though the Queen's influence was powerful, Derek could still feel the faint pulse of his own humanity deep within. His breath quickened as the bond between him and the Queen tightened, but at the same time, he could feel his mind beginning to fight back. "Ava, I'm still in here," Derek whispered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with effort. "We're going to get you back, Derek. Just hold on," Ava urged, her words wrapping around him like a lifeline. Derek could hear her footsteps growing closer, her breathing steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. She wasn't just a soldier, she was his friend, his ally, and she wouldn't give up on him. The alien queen's voice, dark and commanding, filled his mind once again. "You are mine, human. You cannot escape me." The queen's tendrils tightened around him once more, but Derek gritted his teeth and fought through the pain, focusing on his bond with Ava. Slowly, ever so slowly, he began to pull away from the Queen's grasp, breaking free from her mind control, bit by bit. The struggle was grueling, but he could feel himself regaining control. Chapter 6. The Rising Threat. The sound of alien footfalls echoed in the distance, signaling that the Zathor were closing in. The Queen's forces were mobilizing, and Derek knew they had little time. Ava reached him, her hands shaking as she grabbed his arm and helped him to his feet. "You're still with me, Derek," Ava said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Now we need to move. We can't fight them all, but we can make a stand." Derek nodded, though his mind was still clouded by the residual influence of the Queen. He knew they couldn't defeat the Zathor by sheer force. They needed a strategy, a way to break the bond between him and the Queen, something that would free him from her control once and for all. "We have to stop the Queen," Derek said, his voice hoarse but determined. "We destroy the Queen, and the rest of the Zathor will lose their will to fight." Ava looked around, scanning their surroundings for any sign of help or a tactical advantage. "We can't do this alone, but we don't have much of a choice." Together, they sprinted through the wreckage of the battlefield, dodging the scattered debris and alien forces that were scouring the area. Derek could feel the Queen's gaze on him, her presence lingering just below the surface of his mind, watching, waiting for the moment he would falter. As they approached an old communications tower, Ava stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something in the distance. "There," she said, pointing toward a cluster of Zathor soldiers surrounding a large, glowing crystal. It was the same eerie light Derek had seen emanating from the Queen's ship, a source of unimaginable power. The crystals seemed to pulse with energy, and Derek instinctively knew that it was connected to the Queen. If they destroyed it, they might be able to sever the Queen's hold on him and on Earth. "That's our target," Derek said, his voice resolute. "We get to that crystal and we end this." They approached the crystal with stealth, keeping low and using the wreckage of destroyed buildings for cover. Derek's mind was still a battlefield, the Queen's influence pushing back at every step. But the closer they got to the crystal, the stronger his resolve became. He couldn't let the Queen win. As they neared the crystal, they were spotted by a squad of Zathor soldiers. The creatures growled in unison, their glowing eyes fixed on Derek and Ava. There was no time to waste now. "We're not getting out of this one alive," Ava muttered, drawing her weapon. Derek was ready. He wasn't going to let these monsters control him any longer. With a roar, he charged forward, his rifle blazing. Ava followed, firing cover shots as the two soldiers fought their way through the Zathor ranks. The battle was fierce, but Derek could feel something shifting inside him. The Queen's grip was weakening, and with every shot, with every alien that fell, he felt more like himself. Together, they reached the crystal, and Derek wasted no time. He slammed his rifle into the base of the crystal, sending a shockwave through the alien structure. The crystal began to crack, and the energy inside it surged to the surface. "Derek, get back!" Ava shouted, pulling him away just in time. The crystal exploded in a burst of light, the shockwave knocking both soldiers off their feet. Derek's mind spun as the Queen's influence shattered, like glass falling from a great height. The overwhelming presence that had clouded his thoughts was gone. He was free. Chapter 7. The Final Battle. The shockwave from the crystal's explosion rattled the ground beneath Derek and Ava's feet. The Queen staggered forward, fury written across her monstrous face, her tendrils twisting in all directions like serpents hunting for their prey. Her once imposing presence now flickered with a terrifying rage, amplified by the destruction of the crystal. The Zathor soldiers, left without their Queen's command, were scattered and confused, their eyes flickering between instinct and panic. Derek's breath came in ragged gasps as he steadied himself, feeling the weight of the last battle pressing down on him. He was free from the Queen's influence, but the scars of her mental invasion were still raw. Ava stood at his side, determined, though they both knew this was no time for hesitation. The Queen had lost her power, but she was not ready to accept defeat. "We need to end this now," Ava said, her voice firm, her weapon ready. "If she gets control again, it's over for us." Derek nodded, eyes locked on the Queen's towering form as she advanced toward them, the air around her warping with her rage. He could feel the pulse of her power, the force of her ancient will, and knew that killing her was the only way to stop this madness once and for all. The Queen's voice echoed across the battlefield, chilling and dark. "You are nothing. You are weak." She lashed out with a whip-like tendril, the jagged tips slicing through the air. Derek dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike, as Ava fired at the creature's exposed flank. The shots hit, but the Queen barely flinched. She was too strong, too ancient, and her rage only made her more dangerous. For a moment, Derek considered his options. Ava was right. If they didn't act fast, this battle would never end. The Queen was growing more unstable, and the longer she was allowed to rampage, the more likely she was to regain control. Derek had been part of the Special Forces long enough to know that a full assault wouldn't work on an opponent like this, not unless they did something drastic. They needed a plan that went beyond firepower. Ava fired again, her gun tearing into the Queen's armored hide. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, and Derek's mind raced. Then, as if a distant memory sparked, he remembered something he had learned during his time with the Zathor. Their power came not just from their physical strength, but from a deep psychic bond to the source, the crystal, which had now been destroyed. What if there was another way to sever her link to her forces? "Wait, Ava, we have to get to her heart. There's a core, a power center deep within her. We destroy that, and she'll be powerless," Derek shouted, his voice rising with sudden realization. Without waiting for a response, Derek charged, using the wreckage as cover as he closed the distance between himself and the enraged Queen. Ava hesitated only a moment before following suit, firing to keep the Queen distracted. The Queen roared again, her massive body swinging toward Derek. Her tendrils lashed out in fury, but Derek dodged and slid beneath the Queen's massive form. He could feel the heat radiating off her, the dark energy she wielded in every fiber of her being. Ava fired a few more rounds, hitting the Queen's exposed side, and it was enough to make her stagger, just long enough for Derek to find the weak spot. With a quick, brutal strike, Derek drove his combat knife into a soft, glowing spot beneath the Queen's armor. The creature shrieked in agony, the sound deafening as it reverberated across the battlefield. But as the blade pierced deeper, something unexpected happened. The Queen's body began to glow. The deep core that Derek had been aiming for wasn't just the center of her power. It was a vessel, A strange energy pulsed from the queen's chest, spreading outward like the final echo of an ancient dying star. Her form rippled, and for a moment it felt like the entire battlefield was being consumed by an unnatural light. Derek pulled back, stunned. Ava, too, had noticed the change. "What's happening?" The queen's body began to disintegrate, her massive frame collapsing in on itself. But instead of the expected death, something much darker began to unfold. The energy from her core began to surge outward in a violent pulse, rushing to every Zathor soldier still standing on the battlefield. The aliens' bodies shuddered as the energy connected to them, and their eyes glowed brighter with power. "No," Derek whispered. "No, she was connected to them all." The queen's disintegration wasn't just killing her, it was transferring her consciousness into her soldiers. Her psychic grip on the Zathor was complete, and now each of them was imbued with a portion of her dark power. The entire army, now a hive of queen-led drones, moved as one. They were no longer individual soldiers. They were an unstoppable force, bound by the queen's will. Derek and Ava barely had time to react before the flood of Zathor soldiers surged forward, united under their queen's power. It was as if they had only become more powerful, and the queen herself was no longer a single entity. She was now a hive mind, and every soldier was an extension of her wrath. "You think you've won?" The queen's voice boomed, but it came from everywhere, within the soldiers, within the very air around them. "I am not one being, I am many, and you cannot stop me now." Ava's face drained of color as she realized the true extent of what they had unleashed. "Derek, we've made a mistake. We've given them more power than before." Derek turned to face her, his mind racing. The only option now was retreat. There was no way they could fight an army of Zathor who now possessed the combined strength of their queen. The battlefield was already shifting in their favor. The queen had turned her death into something far worse. Suddenly, a strange light flickered in Derek's mind. It was faint, almost like a whisper, and then he heard it again. "Only one can end this. One human." Ava glanced at him, confusion filling her eyes. "What? What does that mean?" Without thinking, Derek realized what he had to do. He glanced back at the disintegrating remains of the queen's form, the pulse of her energy still surging outward. The only way to end this nightmare was for him to sever the link by sacrificing himself. The queen's consciousness surged at that moment, overwhelming. Derek's heart pounded as the final twist unfolded. He knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, he activated the last of his emergency charges, detonating the device in his chest, a suicide device that had been secretly implanted in all high-ranking soldiers as a last resort measure. In an instant, the explosion tore through the very fabric of the queen's power, sending a shockwave that ripped across the battlefield. The Zathor soldiers fell to the ground, their bodies collapsing in on themselves. The queen's will was severed, and with it, her connection to her army. Derek's sacrifice was the key. As the dust settled, Ava found herself standing alone, the only survivor. The battlefield now eerily quiet. The queen was gone. The Zathor were no more. But in the wake of the explosion, a strange silence lingered. Ava stood alone among the ruins, wondering if Derek's final act had truly ended the war, or if the queen's legacy had simply taken another form. The war was over. But at what cost?